They laughed in a teenager's face, insisting no black kid could ever afford to shop there. The boy stood frozen with tears in his eyes until the doors opened and his father appeared with a VIP pass that changed everything. Marcus Williams wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was 16 years old, standing in the electronics aisle of Best Luck's store inside Westfield Mall, chatting with his best friend about school, video games, and how badly he wanted the new PlayStation console. His voice was casual, but then, like kids often do, he said something that made heads turn. "My dad's not picking me up until he's done at the corporate office," Marcus explained, flipping through a game case. "He's the regional manager for the whole chain, so sometimes his schedule's crazy." His friend blinked wide-eyed. "Wait, your dad runs this place? Like actually owns it?" "Yeah," Marcus said with the same ease he used to talk about his favorite cereal. "He's David Williams. He just got back from a meeting with the CEO. They're opening 3 new stores this year." It should have been just another small brag, kids. Toss around. But that's when the sound of laughter cut through the air. It wasn't the soft laugh of someone amused. It was sharp, dismissive, the kind meant to shrink you down. Standing a few feet away, adjusting his security radio, was Officer Jake Morrison, on duty, dressed in his black uniform with a silver badge gleaming under the store lights. He looked more like a bouncer than a mall security guard, but the laugh was his, and it was loud enough for other shoppers to notice. "Regional manager," Morrison said, shaking his head with a grin. "Come on, kid. I've been working security in this mall for 15 years, and I can tell you right now there's no way your dad is running around in corporate offices, especially not," he paused, eyes narrowing, "especially not someone like him." The words stung. The tone stung more. Marcus's face flushed, his lips pressing into a thin line. Around him, people had turned to look. A father with a toddler in his cart lingered nearby, pretending to sort through phone cases but clearly listening. A pair of teenagers whispered behind their hands. Marcus's friend leaned closer, voice low. "Just ignore him. He doesn't know." But ignoring wasn't an option. The security guard wasn't finished. Morrison chuckled again and added, "Look, I get it. Kids like to make up stories. My nephew used to say his dad was a professional athlete. Same kind of thing. Cute, but not real." The heat of embarrassment crawled up Marcus's neck. He wanted to say something to defend his dad, but every word jammed in his throat. His hands trembled as he shoved the game case back onto the shelf, the plastic scraping loudly against the display. "Why would you say that in front of everybody?" his friend whispered nervously. Marcus swallowed hard. "Because it's true." That, defiance, quiet but steady, drew out more laughter from Morrison. He tilted his head, addressing the small circle of strangers now pretending to browse. "See? That's what I'm talking about. Good kid making up a fantasy. Look, son, there's nothing wrong with wanting your dad to be successful, but you don't have to invent fairy tales." Fairy tales. The word landed like a slap. Marcus's father wasn't a fairy tale. He was flesh and blood, working longer hours than anyone Marcus knew. A man who'd picked him up from school in company cars and taken him to office parties where everyone called him Mr. Williams. But standing there under the bright lights of an electronics store, Marcus couldn't prove it. And Morrison knew it. That smug grin told him he felt he'd won. "Tell you what," he said, tapping his badge. "If your dad's really the regional manager, maybe he should come by security sometime. We could use a good laugh." Marcus's chest tightened. He thought of his dad's business cards scattered on their kitchen table, the framed photo of him shaking, hands with the CEO, the way store employees straightened up when he walked through. His father had worked his way up from nothing, spending years proving himself. And here was a man tearing it all down with a smirk in front of an audience. His voice cracked when he finally managed to speak. "You don't know anything about him." That sentence hung in the air. Morrison's smile faltered for just a beat, but he recovered quickly, clapping his hands together like the matter was settled. Sure, kid. Whatever you say. Around them, shoppers exchanged looks, some amused, some uncomfortable, but no one stepped in. No one said, "He's telling the truth." The silence only made Marcus's shame worse. His friend shifted uneasily. "Marcus, maybe we should just wait outside." But Marcus couldn't move. His sneakers felt glued to the polished floor. This wasn't just about being embarrassed. It was about his dad, his truth, his pride, and watching it mocked in front of strangers made his chest burn. Still, he lowered his eyes to the floor tiles, because what could he really do? He was just a kid. But what Marcus didn't know was that the moment he wished for his dad to appear, David Williams was already walking through the sliding glass doors of the mall, his company ID badge clipped to his suit jacket. The electronics store seemed smaller now. Every corner felt filled with eyes, all of them on Marcus. He shifted his weight, hugging his arms around himself. But nothing helped. The security guard's voice carried so easily, bouncing off shelves stacked with phones and racks of accessories. Officer Jake Morrison leaned against the display as if he had all the time in the world, like this was entertainment. "You know," he said with that half-smile that looked more like a sneer, "people don't realize what kind of education it takes to make it into corporate management. Years of business school, working your way up, dealing with million-dollar decisions. It's not exactly the kind of job you hear about at parent-teacher conferences." He laughed again, shaking his head. "And you expect me to believe your dad is one of them?" The words twisted into Marcus's chest like a knot. He wished he could explain, wished he could talk about the times his dad worked weekends, the phone calls that came at dinner because stores had problems, but he couldn't. Not with Morrison staring him down, not with strangers circling like they were waiting for a show. His friend Kevin Chen glanced nervously at the other shoppers. "We should just go," he whispered again. But Marcus shook his head. His throat tightened, but he forced the words out. "I don't care if you believe me. My dad doesn't need your approval." That answer should have ended things, but Morrison wasn't. The kind of man who let a teenager have the last word. He took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough to make it feel personal, but still loud enough for others to hear. "Listen, son. I know you want to feel proud, but making up stories isn't the way. People are going to laugh. And honestly, a kid like you doesn't know what real success looks like." Marcus's ears burned. The tears he refused to let fall blurred the shelves in front of him. Kevin put a hand on his sleeve, but Marcus pulled away, fists clenched at his sides. From across the aisle, a man in a business suit muttered under his breath, "Just let the kid talk, man." His voice wasn't loud enough to carry, and Morrison ignored it. Marcus swallowed and spoke up again, his words shaking, but steady enough to carry. "You're wrong about him. You're wrong about everything." That earned another laugh from Morrison. But this one wasn't just amusement. It was the laugh of someone convinced they'd already won. He looked around the store, almost inviting others to share in the joke. "Wrong, kid. I've worked alongside real executives. I've met the guys who actually run companies, make the big decisions, drive the fancy cars. And trust me, they don't look like your dad." The last sentence landed heavier than anything else he'd said. Marcus froze, his face hot with shame and fury. He knew exactly what Morrison meant, and so did everyone listening. Kevin gasped. "That's not fair," he blurted. "You don't even know him." Morrison turned his gaze on him, his grin spreading wider. "And you do?" he said. "What? Did you two sit around talking about board meetings? Please, I've been in this business longer than you two have been alive. I think I know what's real and what's made up." Kevin shrank back, but Marcus stood his ground, though his hands trembled. "You'll see. He's coming." The security guard smirked. "Sure he is. Maybe he'll arrive in a helicopter, right through the skylight." "Huh?" He chuckled, shaking his head as if the joke were too good to resist. "Don't worry, kid. You'll learn. The world's tough. Better to face the truth now than keep living in make-believe." Shoppers whispered, some shaking their heads, others quietly pulling out phones recording the scene. Marcus noticed a man pretending to look at headphones, his phone angled just slightly toward them. A teenage couple near the checkout nudged each other, pointing. The shame weighed on him like a heavy backpack. For the first time, Marcus wished he hadn't said anything at all. Maybe he should have kept quiet, kept his dad's job private the way David sometimes asked him to. But the thought of Morrison smirking, of everyone believing his version instead of the truth, made his chest burn. He wiped his eyes quickly with the back of his hand and stood taller. "You'll see," he repeated, firmer this time. The security guard leaned back against the rack of phone cases, folding his arms like he'd just solved a case. "We'll see, huh?" he said with a smirk. "All right, then. I'll wait." The silence after his words was louder than the music playing over the store's speakers. Every second stretched, the crowd restless but curious. Some waited to see if Marcus would break, if he'd walk away in shame. He didn't. Shoppers whispered, some shaking their heads, others quietly pulling out phones, recording the scene. Marcus noticed a man pretending to look at headphones, his phone angled just slightly toward them. A teenage couple near the checkout nudged each other, pointing. The shame weighed on him like a heavy backpack. For the first time, Marcus wished he hadn't said anything at all. Maybe he should have kept quiet, kept his dad's job private the way David sometimes asked him to. But the thought of Morrison smirking, of everyone believing his version instead of the truth, made his chest burn. He wiped his eyes quickly with the back of his hand and stood taller. "You'll see," he repeated, firmer this time. The security guard leaned back against the rack of phone cases, folding his arms like he'd just solved a case. "We'll see, huh?" he said with a smirk. "All right, then. I'll wait." The silence after his words was louder than the music playing over the store's speakers. Every second stretched, the crowd restless but curious. Some waited to see if Marcus would break, if he'd walk away in shame. He didn't. But while Marcus stood there, fighting not to cry, his father was already walking past the food court, his dress shoes clicking against the tile floor, about to turn the corner and change everything. Marcus's heart pounded so loudly, he was sure everyone could hear it. He stayed planted in front of the shelves of video games, but his insides were screaming for him to run. He wanted to disappear, wanted to rewind the moment he'd opened his mouth. If he had just said, "My dad's busy," none of this would have happened. Now strangers stared at him like he was the star of a show he never agreed to be in. Officer Jake Morrison stood like he was enjoying a slow afternoon comedy. He rocked back on his heels, arms crossed, his smirk glued in place. "You're awfully quiet now," he said. "Starting to realize you might have stretched the truth a little?" The words stabbed. Marcus kept his eyes down, but Morrison's voice dragged them back up every time. He could almost hear the whispers circling. "Why is he going after him like that?" someone muttered from a few aisles over. "Maybe the kid really did make it up," another voice answered, low, but not low enough. Kevin tugged at his sleeve again. "Marcus, please, let's just wait for your dad outside. You don't have to keep talking to him." But Marcus's chest burned. He wasn't sure if it was anger or shame or both. "I'm not lying," he whispered, mostly to himself. Morrison leaned closer, his voice a notch lower now. "Look, I'm trying to save you from yourself. You run around telling stories like this and people are going to laugh. Not everyone's going to be nice about it. You're better off sticking to the truth. Your dad works hard. He takes care of you. That's enough. No need to pretend he's some kind of corporate big shot." His fingernails dug into his palms. Pretend. That word echoed in his head. Pretend. As if the nights he helped his dad prepare presentations were imaginary. As if the company events where everyone knew his name were dreams. For the first time, doubt slipped in. Not because he questioned his dad, but because he questioned himself. Maybe he shouldn't have spoken so casually. Maybe it was his fault strangers now thought his father's success was a joke. He bit the inside of his cheek so hard it stung. Kevin whispered, "He doesn't matter. You know what's true." But it didn't feel like that. Truth didn't matter when no one believed you. Morrison shifted his weight, glancing around the store like he had an audience to keep entertained. "Tell you what," he said, almost chuckling. "If your dad walks in here wearing a suit and tie, I'll personally escort you to the VIP section myself. But until then, maybe keep the fairy tales at home." Fairy tales again. His vision blurred, but he refused to blink. He wouldn't give Morrison the satisfaction of seeing him cry. A man nearby, holding a basket of accessories, finally spoke. "He's just a kid," he said firmly. Morrison turned his head slowly, locking eyes with the man. "And I'm just telling him the truth. Better he hears it now than keeps embarrassing himself." The man frowned but looked away, shaking his head. No one else said a word. Marcus's stomach twisted. Why didn't anyone defend him? Why was it easier for everyone to stand and watch instead of saying he was right? His father always told him, "Confidence isn't loud, Marcus. Sometimes it's just standing straight when you want to fall down." But standing straight felt impossible when the floor itself seemed to push him down. He pressed his lips together until they hurt. "You'll see," he whispered again, his voice trembling. Morrison sighed as if bored now. "Kid, I've heard it all. Celebrities, athletes, millionaires. Believe me, I've heard every story, and every time it's the same thing. Kids wanting to feel special. Nothing wrong with that. But the truth doesn't need defending." His words dug deep, because wasn't that exactly what he was doing? Defending? If the truth was so obvious, why did he feel like he was losing? Kevin stepped between them, his small frame almost shaking. "You're being mean. He's not lying." Morrison arched a brow. "And how do you know?" "Because I've seen his dad's office. I've been to company parties. He has business cards and everything." Kevin stopped, realizing the words sounded thin against Morrison's disbelief. Morrison chuckled under his breath. "Business cards? Anyone can print those at Kinko's. Doesn't make it real." Marcus clenched his jaw. He hated that Morrison had an answer for everything. Hated that every word he spoke made the crowd lean a little closer, like he was telling the version that made sense. His knees felt weak, but he forced himself to stand straighter. "You'll see," he repeated for the third time, the words coming, out stronger this time. Morrison tilted his head, smiling like a man humoring a child. "All right, I'm waiting." The crowd wasn't whispering anymore. They were just watching. The air thickened with expectation, every second dragging like an hour. Marcus could barely breathe, his thoughts racing, his palms slick with sweat. And then, just faintly, he heard it. The sound of dress shoes against tile, steady and certain. But what Marcus didn't realize yet was that his dad's arrival wouldn't just end the laughter. It would flip the entire store upside down. The sliding, glass doors at the mall entrance whispered open, letting in a burst of chatter and footsteps from the main corridor. David Williams strode through with a confidence that made people step aside without him saying a word. His navy suit was perfectly pressed, the company logo embroidered on his jacket pocket, his leather briefcase swinging at his side. He'd just left a meeting with the district managers and had decided to surprise his son by picking him up himself. He hadn't expected to walk into a crowd. From across the store, Marcus caught sight of him instantly. Relief hit his chest so hard it almost knocked his breath away. His heart jumped. But so did his fear, because now his father was about to see everything. David's dress shoes clicked against the polished tile in a rhythm that didn't change. His gaze swept across the displays of electronics, the line of shoppers, then stopped on the small group gathered near the gaming section. His son, face red, fists balled at his sides, Beside him, Kevin, looking both scared and protective. And standing across from them, Officer Morrison leaning back like he owned the space. David's jaw tightened. He crossed the aisle, his company badge catching the light as shoppers instinctively moved out of his way. Marcus's throat went dry. He wanted to run into his dad's arms, but something about the way David moved, focused, determined, made him stay frozen. Morrison spotted him too. At first, his grin didn't fade. He assumed David was just another parent arriving to pick up his kid. But as David came closer, the company logo on his jacket was impossible to miss. Morrison's smirk faltered for half a second before he caught himself. "Dad!" Marcus's voice cracked louder than he meant, but the relief in it silenced even the shoppers who'd been whispering. David stopped beside his son, his hand resting lightly on Marcus's shoulder. The tension in Marcus's body melted just a little under the touch. "What's going on?" David asked, his voice calm but carrying weight. Morrison straightened, shifting. His weight then forced a polite smile. "Evening, sir. Just clearing up a misunderstanding." David's eyes flicked from Morrison to the circle of strangers, then back to his son. Marcus's lips trembled. "He said you couldn't be who you are, that I made it up." The words tumbled out, half shame, half desperation. David didn't respond immediately. He simply studied Morrison, the silence stretching just long enough for the security guard to feel it. Morrison gave a chuckle that sounded more nervous this time. "Kids, you know how they are. Big imaginations. I was just having a little fun with him." David's voice stayed even, but it cut clean. "You mocked my son in front of strangers and called him a liar." The man's shoulders stiffened. "Now hold on. I didn't call him that. I just said he was stretching the truth." David interrupted. "And you decided it was a joke. Tell me, Officer Morrison, what exactly made it so funny?" The use of his name was deliberate. Morrison's face tightened. A couple of the shoppers glanced at one another, surprised David knew. The badge on Morrison's belt suddenly felt heavier under the lights. He cleared his throat. "Look, sir, with all due respect." David raised a hand slightly. "Respect doesn't begin with laughter at a child." The store had gone quiet. Even the background music seemed softer, as if the air itself paused to listen. Marcus stood taller now, the weight of shame lifting as his father's presence filled the space. Kevin's eyes widened, almost in awe. Morrison shifted again, the confidence draining by degrees. "I didn't mean anything by it. Just thought it was unusual, that's all." David tilted his head. "Unusual doesn't mean impossible. It means you've never seen it. And maybe the problem is less about me being here and more about you never imagining I could be." His voice wasn't raised, but the words struck harder than any shout. Marcus looked up at his father, pride swelling inside his chest. He wanted Morrison to say something now. He wanted him to try, but he didn't. His mouth opened slightly, then shut again, his smirk finally gone. The man with the accessory basket whispered to the person beside him, "He's the real thing." The teenage couple at the checkout muttered, "No way. That's actually him." David's hand rested on his son's shoulder. "I know, but sometimes moments like this teach us more than 100 quiet days ever could. You don't forget them, and neither does anyone who watched." Kevin looked up at David, his eyes wide. "You were amazing. Everyone was listening to you." David gave a small smile. "I wasn't just talking to him. I was talking to all of you. Never let anyone tell you your truth doesn't matter." A man in a polo shirt, the same one who had muttered earlier, finally spoke up louder. "Sir, thank you. I've got a son myself. He's 14. I hope he grows up with that kind of courage." David nodded once, the simple gesture carrying weight. Courage isn't about not being scared. It's about speaking anyway. Marcus's chest swelled. Hearing those words said in front of strangers made him feel like his father's pride in him was carved into the air. As the shoppers began to drift away, a woman paused near David. She lowered her voice, but spoke clearly enough for Marcus to hear. "Thank you for standing up for him, and thank you for showing that guard he was wrong." David's gaze softened. "We all stand up in our own ways. Today, my son stood up by telling the truth. That's something worth respecting." The woman smiled and walked off, leaving David and Marcus standing by the games that suddenly didn't seem so important anymore. Marcus turned to his dad. "Did I make it worse by saying it?" David shook his head. "You made it better. You didn't hide who I am. You spoke the truth even when people laughed. That takes more strength than some adults ever learn." For a moment, Marcus felt the weight of what had happened lift off him. He could breathe again. Kevin gave him a quick squeeze. "Told you he was wrong." Marcus laughed softly, wiping his eyes. "Yeah, you did." They walked toward the exit together, David's dress shoes steady against the tile. People still glanced. At them, but not with ridicule now, with something closer to admiration. As they stepped out into the wider mall, Marcus's mind replayed the scene. The laughter, the whispers, the sting of doubt, and then his dad's voice, clear and strong, cutting through all of it. He realized that even though it had been one of the hardest moments of his young life, it had also been one of the most important. David slowed his stride and bent slightly toward his son. "Marcus, remember this. People will doubt you. They'll laugh, dismiss you, try to make you smaller. But you never let them take your truth. Not for me, not for anyone. Promise me that." Marcus looked up at his dad, eyes shining. "I promise." David kissed the top of his son's head, the simple gesture stronger than any speech. By the time they reached the car, Marcus felt lighter. He still carried the memory of Morrison's smirk, but it no longer weighed him down. Instead, it reminded him of something else: how quickly a person's assumptions can crumble when faced with the truth. And as the car doors shut and the mall disappeared behind them, Marcus leaned back against the seat, his hands still gripping Kevin's, and thought, "I'll never be embarrassed about Dad again." Because that day, in a crowded store under bright fluorescent lights, he had learned a lesson that would stay with him forever. Never let anyone laugh you out of your own truth. And maybe, just maybe, the people who had witnessed it learned something, too. That respect costs nothing, but withholding it can scar someone deeply. David started the car, glanced in the rearview mirror, and said softly, "You boys ready to head home?" Marcus smiled for the first time since the ordeal began. "Yeah, let's go home." The mall faded into the distance, but the lesson stayed. And for everyone who heard it, whether they admitted it out loud or not, it would linger long after the sound of David's dress shoes had faded from the tile floor. Life has a way of putting us in moments we don't expect, moments that test whether we'll stay quiet or speak up, whether we'll shrink or stand tall. If this story touched you, let it be a reminder. Always defend the truth, no matter who tries to silence it. And if you want to hear more stories like this, make sure to subscribe.